Hey guys, Moose here. If you don't know who I am, I'm a Hunter Through Your Crafter and Guide Writer. I love to push High Mythic Plus, and I'm planning on competing in the next upcoming MDI. In this video, we're going to take a look at the new Season 2 Mythic Plus affix Reaping. We're still learning more about it, and I'm sure we'll have more info on it once it hits live servers. This video is a compiled list on everything we know about it so far, along with some tips and tricks on how to deal with it. Reaping is the new level 10 Keystone affix that will replace Infested starting on January 22nd or January 23rd for EU. Infested had a sort of classic WoW feel, where using crowd control with smaller pulls was typically the smarter choice. Reaping is sort of the opposite. Since you are no longer restricted by random infested mobs, larger pulls are now viable. Classes that have consistent, large AoE will reign supreme with this affix. So, what is Reaping? Reaping will occur 5 times throughout any dungeon. The occurrences are based on enemy forces percentage. For every 20% of enemy forces that accumulates, the previous 20% of trash spawn as a ghost and will charge towards the group. This means that you will get a reaping wave at 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, and 100%. Every time you kill a mob that awards percent, a ghost will spawn from their corpse. At each of these percentages, the sky will turn a bluish color. After a few seconds, waves of mobs spawning from their corpses will run towards the party. Here's what we know about reaping so far. 1. There are 3 unique types of ghosts that spawn with reaping. When the living mob dies, it is separated into one of 3 possible types of ghosts. Weaker NPCs will spawn as risen souls. Risen souls are just melee mobs that will apply Reap Soul to their target. Reap Soul deals 2% of the player's maximum health every 3 seconds. This ability stacks. It can also be purged by a magic dispel. Risen souls typically die fairly easily, but if it gets out of hand, the healer should dispel it. Caster NPCs will spawn as tormented souls. These guys will cast Gravebolt, a long 5-second cast that will target random party members, dealing 25% of their maximum health every successful cast. The group should aim to interrupt as many tormented souls as possible, reducing the amount of Gravebolts that might go off. Line of sighting or gripping these guys in help a ton when AoEing everything down. Finally, we have Lost Souls. These guys spawn from tankier mobs in the dungeons, such as Templars or Brutes. Lost Souls will cast Shadow Smash, which is a ground AoE effect dealing damage and reducing the player's maximum health by 20% for 1 minute. When a Lost Soul dies, they leave behind Expel Soul. This summons a ton of green swirlies on the ground. Any player hit by these takes a ton of damage, is knocked back, and has their damage and healing reduced by 10% for 30 seconds. This stacks per projectile hit. Lost Souls make it difficult for melee to deal consistent damage, especially when you have 3 or 4 of these going off at the same time. Reaping mobs die fairly quickly in lower dungeons, so some of these abilities may not be of concern to you. As the key scales to higher difficulties, avoiding as many of these abilities and controlling the casters is key to efficiently taking these mobs down. 2. Reaping mobs are not affected by other affixes directly. This means that reaping mobs can stand in Sanguine, will not bolster each other when they die, will not spawn explosives, etc. Obviously, party-wide affixes such as Grievous and Quaking will not halt while reaping is under effect. 3. Reaping mobs spawn with 50% of the health based on the living mob they spawn from. For example, a neutral blob in Shrine of the Storm with 100k health will have 50k health as the ghost. A mini-boss in Shrine of the Storm with 2 million health will have 1 million health as a ghost. The health the ghosts have is calculated when the living mob dies. This means that reaping scales with fortified and with bolstering. Since bolstering a mob increases its maximum health, bolstering a mob will directly have an effect on how much health it has when it spawns as a ghost. Just to clarify, as I said earlier, the reaping mobs themselves will not bolster each other, simply their health is affected prior to when they spawn. Naturally, this means that in an ideal situation, you want to skip as many high health mobs as possible. It also goes without saying that you want to avoid bolstering mobs unnecessarily. 4. When reaping is triggered, the mobs will come running from where they were killed. If you killed half the trash on the second floor of Toldagor and half the trash on the third floor of Toldagor, the mobs spawning on the second floor will take longer to reach you. Ideally, you want to try to kill the mobs in the same area to easily group up mobs when they spawn. Killing mobs behind you and in front of you in multiple waves can be a nightmare for tank threat, so be smart on your routes. Try to clear the dungeons in clumps and take into account when and where each reaping mob will spawn. 5. If a reaping wave spawns as the dungeon is ending, you will not have to deal with the final wave. If you finish all of the bosses and then complete the trash afterwards, your final reaping wave will spawn. However, the dungeon will be complete, effectively letting you skip your final wave of reaping and saving some time in the dungeon. 6. If you end up wiping to a wave of reaping, they do not despawn. The ghosts will run back to where their bodies spawned. However, they will not reset completely. Similar to how island expeditions work, their health will not reset. After returning to their corpses, the ghosts have a 45-yard aggro radius and will automatically engage in combat and charge at you if you or another party member comes in range. If you manage to avoid the remaining reaping mobs, they will still trigger when the following wave of reaping occurs, unless you finish the dungeon, of course. Finally, reaping comes with an added perk. As you're doing the dungeon, you'll notice Bwonsamdi will be at every respawn point throughout the dungeon. If your group fails and the timer expires in the keystone, excluding deaths, you may speak with Bwonsamdi to strike a deal with him. Players may accept Bwonsamdi's bargain. Accepting his deal will earn you the Bwonsamdi's bargain buff, increasing your health and damage by 20% for the remainder of the dungeon. Of course, nothing in this world is free. Accepting his buff gives you a debuff called Death's Burden, preventing you from striking another deal with Bwonsamdi for 2 hours. Really, the only reason this buff is there is just to help the group finish their dungeon, should it be a little too hard or if they need a little bit extra assistance. This is a huge perk for those looking to just complete the dungeon and don't really care about the timer. Okay, so let's talk about some tips and tricks to reaping. Okay, so now that you know what reaping is, how does this affect the dungeons and the routes? It goes without saying that heavy AoE classes will be awesome here, preferably classes with shorter cooldowns or on-demand AoE. Pending buffs or nerfs, classes such as Outlaw, Havoc, Ellie, Windwalker, BM Hunters, Unholy Decays, Fire and Frost Mages, and even Demo Warlocks are all pretty strong contenders. Obviously, you'll still want classes with a ton of utility and battle reses such as Boomkins. Of course, you also don't need 3 DPS classes with a ton of AoE and no boss damage, so finding a healthy balance between damage and utility is always good. Remember, dungeons aren't about how much overall damage you do, but rather how fast you complete the dungeon. In terms of routes, Reaping will slightly alter the routes you took in Season 1. You'll want to do pulls with these 3 things in mind. First, you want to try to clump up trash in chunks of 20%. You want the mobs to group up quickly. This will give the tank a much easier time picking up aggro, and will of course allow the DPS to more efficiently AoE everything down. Ideally, you want to prevent mobs from coming at you from 2 different directions or being separated. In some dungeons, this can't really be helped. Try fighting reaping waves at choke points or line of sight around walls to easily group up the mobs as they spawn. Remember that reaping mobs spawn from where the corpse is, so dragging mobs to other areas might help you out with reaping. Second, you want to avoid as many high health mobs as possible. For example, in Freehold, Ludwig von Tortolan gives percent, meaning he spawns a ghost. As a mini-boss, especially on fortified weeks, he has a ton of health. Ideally, you want to avoid him because this ghost takes forever to kill. You can gain your percent in a way that you spawn your 80% reaping wave just before pulling Ludwig, so that when he's killed, he will be a part of your final reaping wave. Finish all the bosses and complete your trash last so that you may skip the final reaping wave and you can avoid dealing with Ludwig's giant ghost. Another example can be seen in Shrine of the Storm. It may be more beneficial to skip the Guardian Elemental or Windspeaker Heldis to avoid the ghosts from their reaping mobs. Dealing with high health ghosts just adds a ton of extra time and is not really necessary. Finally, you will need to take into account your group's cooldowns and how often they're available. You don't want to do a giant pull with 15% of trash, only to have a giant reaping wave spawn seconds later with no cooldowns available. You typically will want to do a large trash pull, followed by a smaller one just before reaping spawns, to allow the group to get their cooldowns back. You also don't want a giant wave of reaping to spawn mid-pull, so try to calculate the proper trash percentage with MDT ahead of time. Unfortunately, in some dungeons such as King's Rest, this is unavoidable. As a final tip, currently Shadow Meld works to ignore reaping mobs. If all party members Shadow Meld and are more than 45 yards away from the reaping mobs, reaping will not pull. However, the mobs will still aggro from the following reaping wave. Alliance players can use this to their advantage to avoid a couple reaping waves throughout different dungeons. Hopefully this isn't intended, but it wouldn't surprise me if they let this go through. Alright guys, that about sums up Reaping in a nutshell. Personally, I find Reaping super fun in comparison to Infested, and I'm super excited for the upcoming Mythic Plus season. It allows for bigger and better pools, which are always fun to see. As always, follow and subscribe for more Mythic Plus info and all things Hunter. Check out my BM Hunter Mythic Plus guide out now on Wowhead. Thanks for watching, guys.